Hi, this is Paul. Thought it'd be good to pull back a little bit and get a little perspective at where 8 years has been. Of course, it all started with the Jordan Peterson thing, but it went some other places since then. So let's talk about the meaning crisis and what I'll call the reductive imaginary. John Vervaeke in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis basically tells a story of a dead universe, save me, maybe, and then we die in it. And that, if you read Ian McGilchrist, there's an essay out on the internet that was prior to The Master and His Emissary, which is prior to The Matter with Things. Things just got from an essay to a book to a massive book. But at the heart of the book is the observation that others have made too, that once you explain something, you reduce it. And especially in a scientific imaginary or reductive imaginary, you begin to imagine that, well, all I am is sperm plus egg and then time and genetics. And that's a serious reduction of what a human being is. You see this in the myth that Rationality Rules says with his little pool metaphor, that humanity is just, it's just basically Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Glenn Scrivener points that out in his video response to that whole thing. It's just basically Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And it's utter foolishness. It just does not bear up under any scrutiny at all. But the meaning crisis is very real. And it's, in some ways, especially men and women get hit with it differently. And as I continue to work with this Ramy series that's on YouTube, that's on Hulu, I'm rewatching it now, and it really is excellent. It's excellent because for most of you, you were growing up in a Christian nation and it's Christian religion, but the religious questions are very analogous when it comes to Christianity and Judaism and Islam. And they probably have some real analogies if you're from India. I should probably get my friend Raj on here and talk about Sikh with him, because I think about Raj often as I'm watching Ramy, because similar issues are going in, but Sikhi and the Sikh people have had such a different experience, partly because they've been so brutalized by the Hindus and the Muslims and the state of India in the Punjab. So there's a lot going on there. But in terms of dealing with secularism and secularity, many of the same issues are going to emerge. And so it's really fun to deal with something that's not haunting you. So if you're a Christian, you're going to have all kinds of other issues with things deeply emotionally than if you're watching an Islamic story. There's a certain separation and difference that if you're watching an Islamic story, you can see things differently because they're not so close to you in your Christian heritage. But yet many of the things that happen are very, very similar. And so this meaning crisis with secularity and modernity sort of goes through the world in different ways and at different times, and obviously in different ways. But one of the things I like about Kevin Flatt's Sacred Social Order is because that sort of levels the playing field, and then this reduction of a religion becomes a thing that is quite easy to see. And like in my own tradition of Dutch Calvinism, I mean, they've been battling this for 150 years. And, some of the lights of my tradition, like Abram Kuyper and Herman Bavinck, these guys were dealing with it in the 19th century as they were growing up. And so much of the formation of some of the better parts of my tradition come from Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck wrestling with these issues. But these issues are happening all around the world, and especially with immigrants that immigrate to a place like the United States or to Western Europe. Domicide is key in there. Now, late in season 1, there's an episode where Ramy has basically been sleeping with a married woman in the mosque, from the mosque, and he gets confronted by his father, and he decides, and then he hears the immigrant story of his father. And his father's immigrant story is his grandfather basically told his father, don't go to America because you'll lose your children. Your children will lose the Islamic faith. You have to stay here in Egypt and they'll keep the faith. Now, Ramy's going to go to Egypt and he's going to discover that secularism is in Egypt too. And it's different. And instead, so many of his cousins in Egypt, they just want to go to America and they want American things. And Ramy wants to go back to Egypt. He's having this roots experience, and he's looking for, his own grandfather who is Kunta Kinte, and he wants to have this. And he goes to Egypt and he discovers that Egypt is shot through with all of this too. And again, I know that the title of my last video was provocative, but there are deep similarities in terms of what people are going, especially millennials and Gen Zers and many people who are looking back to traditional religion. And it was amazing, again, back in 2018, 2019, when we began with John Vervaeke and he was talking about the legacy religions, and his position there was sort of like, well, the legacy religions are cooked. Modernity has made them inconceivable. But the tide has turned. If you saw Jonathan Peugeot's video today.
An example of symbolic interpretation and how symbolic interpretation is far superior than sometimes what we call literal descriptions or historically accurate descriptions. And this is actually a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, so I'll have to hold back not to fall into rant mode.
Oh, he'll rant plenty. He will definitely be in rant mode. But one of the ways to understand this is on the other end of deconstruction. And if you know Jonathan's story, he goes, first he's Quebecois, so you have the whole Quiet Revolution in Quebec, where this whole province that used to look back onto France as France really lost it. We're preserving what the French had, and then the whole thing in rapid motion just collapses. Similar things happened, are in some ways maybe happening in the CRC in terms of they left the Netherlands and, we escaped the Netherlands. We escaped the old collapsing world. But then they hit their meaning crisis and collapses. And when this is something that people are often sort of tagging Jonathan on, is Jonathan's not going to go back and sort of be a fundamentalist apologist who's going to die on the hill of where exactly the spikes were and how many Jerichos there were and having to try to, situate the synoptics, all the stuff that someone like T. Grogan, if you know the corner, or Sam Harris, or any of these atheists will sort of poke at. Jonathan's not going to play with any of that. He's going to say, I don't care if the Bible is a rough approximation. What's happening here is meaning first.
To think about that, but it's definitely should never become the central question. It should never become the thing that interests you the most. The thing that interests you the most is the meaning, because the meaning is the reason why you represent something, and the meaning is the reason why you remember it. And so this, of course, feeds into all kinds of things, to all kinds of things, and the way in which we remember things and the way in which we represent things. When they move towards meaning, we shouldn't freak out. We shouldn't say, well, to be historically accurate and to be, to be scientifically accurate, we should represent things this way. This is most often a mistake, because if you move towards detail and you move toward idiosyncrasy and you move towards something that is just showing the mechanical cause of something, one of the things you're doing is that you're moving away from the meaning. And of course,
now I was talking about this with a little group. For people who talk, especially for a living or a lot, or are celebrated for their talking, there's always this, I don't want to leave poor Jonathan looking like that. There's always this hope that I can talk my way out of this. Meaning, if I just find the right words, I can transmit to you the fact that I'm not hung up on what a doctor in the 1950s who tried, or it was probably in the 70s, because I read some of those things. Doctors tried to re-examine the crucifixion, and all of that was, in some ways just downstream from the search of the historical Jesus. It's all downstream from this whole swamp of historical accuracy versus biblical representation versus, I got that in year one in seminary because, and my New Testament scholar, David Howard, basically said right off the bat, he said, look, you can go down this road with the synoptics and just try to square it all. It's a fool's errand. It's pointless. And you run into it in Old Testament. The Christian Reformed Church was very moderate on these things. It wasn't, what was that? What was the guy? His son now teaches, or his son is a big YouTuber out of Biola. But, it was all these, and Norm Geisler, he was one of them. You can find all of these apologetics works just trying to square all of the little details of the Bible and clean it up all nicey. But the problem with that is you're never going to be able to do it, and you're certainly not going to be able to do it to everyone's satisfaction. And you make your faith in the Christian Reformed Church, they had a paper on this, Report 44 in 1973, the event character, you're never going to finally convince someone of this. And so, Jonathan, he often gets tagged with this. It comes up when he's talking to people. You're not one of those people that believes that Jesus rose out of the tomb. Yes, I am. Well, if there was a video camera and what about the conflicting witnesses? And it's like, that path is not a path of faith. You don't work your way up to faith with it. Faith is a gift. Now, you might bolster or have some security about it, but that's not the way belief and faith work. So, where are we now? So you've got domicide, you've got the meaning crisis, then you've got the, is this all there is? People get to the reductive imaginary and the frustration with it and the end of it, and it sets them on a path looking for something else. And for many people, it's this deconstruction pipeline. And boy, I thought Nathan Jacobs, he's worked on this a ton because he's lived it. Remember, he talked about his story. His mother was Missouri Synod Lutheran. His father was nothing. And then you can go back in the Nathan Jacobs playlist on my channel where he tells his story. He's told his story many times and places, and you'll hear different nuances different times you hear it. And then he studied this because he lived this. And the recent telling of his deconstruction pipeline, I think, is one of the better ones I've heard.
I also have since done work on sort of the indicators of when somebody might begin to become theologically unstable or become, they start to switch, right? And so they untether from their tradition and they start to wander around and look at other things, and at some point dissociate if they can't find what they're looking for, as well as looking at the patterns of, conversion. And not surprisingly, those two things line up very well. And you start to see that some of the indicators, some of the predictors of switching are oftentimes existential, they're experiential. They're things like as simple as, do my parents practice this religion at home, or just do they go on Sundays, or worse, they only go on, Christmas and Easter, right? Do they affirm what the church is teaching, or are they like, yeah, we go to church, but yeah, don't listen to the church, they're all wrong on this sort of thing? Are they in agreement? Does one practice the religion and does the other not? In things like divorce, right? In the divorce, okay, well, do the parents in this situation or in crisis generally turn to the religion, or do they turn to something else? And so do they talk about the religion at home? There's a lot of these sort of factors that basically, if you distill them down, it comes down to, did it seem like this thing was practiced, believed, lived, and produced an environment that felt authentic, right? It felt in some ways healthy and good and right. And if the answer is it felt efficient, and that can be in the home life, it can also be, it carries over onto the church life. Did I feel like my pastor didn't really care and this was just a job? Did I feel like there was a place for me within the church? A lot of the same sort of things carry over into the ecclesial context. You can see that oftentimes the dissociation and the switching is a product of those sorts of features. And then when you look at, there was a dissertation done actually in Michigan on reconversion. This is looking specifically to Catholicism and to more traditional forms of Catholicism, which tends to be what the conversions are. It's interesting. You can see the exact parallel. They start to, it oftentimes involves encounters with people, sometimes monks or nuns or priests or somebody like that, who really does in flesh or in body the sort of thing that they didn't experience growing up. So there's something here that feels grounded, that feels sober, that feels holy, that feels lived and incarnate about this faith tradition. Um, and I think also with that, there's this transitional phase that you also find with the nuns. So one of the things that I've talked about with the religiously unaffiliated is that the evolution of a nun, that nun, N-O-N-E-S, right, for everybody, right, the religiously unaffiliated, not Catholic or Orthodox nuns or something like that. But the evolution of the religiously unaffiliated tends to be a certain form of disillusion that moves into switching, like I talked about. If they don't find something that grounds them, they end up dissociating. And that could be either I have no religion, I'm a nun, right? Or it means I'm a done, meaning I'm done with church. I would still say I believe in Jesus. Maybe I even call myself a Christian, but I don't practice it, right, in any way. And what's interesting is about once that dissociation happens, there is first one of the first stages that people move through is they actually move into the paranormal and the occult. And that's one of the things that I've talked about in the past, which is kind of surprising for a lot of people. But I'm not the only person who noted this, right? The Pew Research Center noted this. Clay Rutledge ended up dealing with this, sociologist. And basically, I think when you interview the religiously unaffiliated, you can see why, right? And the reason is that oftentimes when talking about the existential side of this, the religiously unaffiliated will talk about the problem of evil, but what they're describing is not the problem of evil, it's the problem of divine hiddenness. I wanted God to show up. My parents were in crisis and I prayed and God didn't answer, right? It's this idea that where is God in the midst of this? And and so the movement toward the paranormal and the cult is actually a movement toward I still want to know that I live in a spiritual world. I still want some sort of meaning. And if God won't talk to me, but something else will move a Ouija board or talk into my, tape recorder or, give me some sort of thrill or woo, right, related to the paranormal, that's good enough, right? It still tells me I'm in a spiritual world. And since I'm not doing an organized religious practice, that scratches that itch that says I'm still a spiritual being in a spiritual world. And so as long as I'm living in a way that, is me being a good person, I'm fulfilling that spiritual need with that sort of vague spirituality. But the problem is, as Clay Rutledge also pointed out, there's an inverse relationship between a sense of meaning and the paranormal and the occult. So the deeper you go into it, the less meaning you experience. And so normally what happens is that leads to disillusion. At some point, there starts to be a burnout and a sense of meaninglessness in the midst of this vague spirituality.
Hmm.
And the result is actually, predictably, a movement toward basically politics, where essentially you trade out the search for meaning in the spiritual for the search for meaning in the social and political. And that's one of the reasons why when people are like, well, it seems almost like people are almost religious in their zeal about political issues, it's because they're not almost religious, they are religious in the pursuit of that. And no surprise, that also becomes a form of burnout. You find yourself angry, you find yourself depressed, you find yourself not finding the sort of meaning that you're looking for. And I think the thing that's rather intriguing is that all sets the stage oftentimes for some type of crisis. And that crisis can be it can be something as simple as I'm having kids and suddenly I'm looking at the world and I'm looking at morality and I'm looking at how do I raise this person, and you start to rethink religion. Sometimes you talked about the Peugeot-Peterson, pipeline. Sometimes it's just that they're running up against aspects of the worldview in the political space that just don't seem right. And so they start to rethink things and question what they think, and they start to find that the people they're listening to or resonating with are all religious. And so they start to think, well, maybe religion isn't dumb. But there's a number of different places where this goes, where there's usually some form of encounter. Oftentimes, actually, one of the more peculiar or unexpected one is you just go down the pipeline of weird internet stuff like giants and conspiracy theories, and before you know it, even though you're listening to people who are talking about UFOs and whatever else, you're now into giant lore and alternate histories, and all of a sudden the religions are back into the conversation, and so you start to rethink things a little bit, and that will oftentimes be its own sort of catalyst for starting to listen to voices, oftentimes in Orthodox circles like Lord of Spirits or something like that, that is unexpected, and now you're starting to rethink what you thought you knew about Christianity. So whatever the reason, there's usually some sort of thing that reopens them to religion. But of course, the reopens is not, I'm going to go back to my roots because that was empty. And so now I'm looking for something new. And and if you still have a tether to Christianity, I think this is one of the things that I've talked about, that Orthodoxy has an advantage precisely because it's different, right? It's different aesthetically, it's different in terms of its ethos, it's different culturally, and it's different theologically. And so all of a sudden, it allows somebody who is still inclined to think, if I were to return to religion, I guess what I'm most comfortable with is Christianity because I grow out of Christian culture, but I can't go back to that.
Now, again, part of what's so interesting about Ramy is he's wrestling with all of these things. He's having to do it fairly quickly. And now, of course, this is the scene in the first episode where he's having sex with his Jewish girlfriend. And he's just talked to his mother about maybe finding a Muslim woman to marry. And so he's just an American in that he's having sex with whoever's willing to have sex with him. And he's being really careful. And so she catches him testing the rubber, and then they have a conversation, and it just all goes badly. It begins with, no, like, you're Muslim. I thought in the way that I'm Jewish, like it's a cultural thing. I didn't know that you were a Muslim. And then it just goes on from there because, well, but you drink. Well, I don't really drink. Oh, and you just help everybody else drink. And basically she just confronts him. And this is one of the enduring elements of the show, that he's just sitting on the fence. He's conflicted. He thinks he might want to be a Muslim, but he doesn't. And this is an old story. I remember even back in the 80s, other students at Calvin College, just listening to other students, you could tell the time was much different there. There was sort of much more in young people. They were searching, there were questions, but many of them just sort of decided that they were going to sort of follow the track. They were going to look for a spouse at the Christian college. Some of them would try one way or another to avoid premarital sex, but some did, some didn't. But they very quickly got married after college, and they settled down and had kids, and many of them went to the church and so on and so forth. That was my generation. Decades later, some of them fall away, but a higher percentage are still in the church. But it's their children's generation that much less. And what was so striking in this Justin Brierley conversation between Anil Seth and Ian McGilchrist. Ian McGilchrist grows up without no faith in either of his parents because, this is different in the UK. And, McGilchrist is older than I am. but he eventually, sort of in kind of a Tom Holland way, comes to some sort of his own faith, partly because he just believes it, and he's got various different classifications for it, and but Seth is not there, and just how Seth goes through it, it was very, well, like, I'm not a Hindu, but it's like I kind of want to get in touch with my roots. And he's feeling the domicide because his mother was Catholic and his father was Hindu, and just all of the cognitive science and the psychology says wisdom, the religion is important, and people who have a vibrant religious faith do better than people who don't. They stay married longer, they earn more money, they have less depression, they're healthier, they live longer. And I've got plenty of times when John Vervaeke would admit that and say, yeah, but it doesn't matter which religion. And right there, you sort of have this deconstruction again, because religion is this app on your phone that might improve your performance in different ways and might make you feel better. Maybe it'll help address your meaning crisis. But, back then in the early days when Vervaeke was still talking about a religion that's not a religion, and legacy religions, and the legacy religions are toast and they're going away. He doesn't talk that way any now, because basically the deeper he got into it, the more he realized that you can't just make up for yourself a religious practice. You just don't have enough lifetime. It's all the problems of combinatorial explosiveness, and you just can't do it. And so for many people, you're going to want to put a religious app on your phone. This gets into the sacred social order. Is religion just an app or the operating system? And, so I thought, what he says here is just a perfect illustration.
Quite what we want to say about that in relation to God, I think that you're really you have to be very determined not to come up with something that basically looks like God. And, something that underlies this, something that gives it its direction, something that is, and this is what I love about the Christian mythos, that is actually involved in that process, is not just remote Olympian God, but is actually present in it.
Stepped into creation.
Stepped into creation. Of course, I don't think it needs to be thought of in exactly that way. I don't want to get involved in an argument about the historicity of Christ, and because I think these things are fruitless and really we don't know. But
the story as it stands.
I don't object to people saying that really it's very important that he is a historical figure and he was the Son of God. And, I'm not saying that's wrong, but all I'm saying is, for me, the important thing about that story is what it tells us. I don't know any other mythos that has so many strands in it that are so beautiful.
I mean, this brings us into sort of, as we start to land the conversation, Anil, where we began actually, the fact that you came from a family that did have some sort of religious associations, but that sort of lapsed along the way. I mean, presumably even as someone who spent their life in laboratories and research around consciousness, brains, neuroscience, and so on, I can imagine you're very sympathetic to those who do go in the direction of Ian, seeing that there must be a sort of spiritual, ultimate kind of mind behind things into which we can tap into essentially through meditation, prayer, and those sorts of things. I don't know if that's anything you've ever been drawn towards yourself as someone interested in brain states and consciousness, but do you see a value at least in those kinds of approaches to?
Very much. I think it's abundantly evident that the society we live in now is desperate for some sort of spiritual renewal. The sort of the promise of a completely spiritual, a world denuded of any kind of spirituality is turning out to be not the world that's really a world we want to live in or we want to raise our children in. I think this follows from the kinds of creatures that we are, and whether we were always going to be that way or whether we've just turned out to be that way, that is the way that we are. We have this need, and I think it seems that society more generally is reorienting a little bit that way, but it's doing it in many different ways. So as you said, there's a resurgence of people involved in meditation. You know, and some people get their spiritual fix from psychedelics, other things as well, from nature. For me, is much more attuned. You know, just walking out in the world without my AirPods in is a very spiritual reconnecting experience. This is incredibly important.
What do you mean by that, though? That's interesting. You say that this is sort of when you feel, I would assume you might use a word like transcendent, spiritual in that context. But what does that mean for you? You obviously aren't necessarily saying there's a God behind this. What is it that is different from your other experiences?
So I think for me, it's a return to a way of existing that is not in the process of always analyzing things, that is more directly connected to my nature as a living creature that happens to be right here and right now, that is part of and not apart from the rest of nature.
It sounds somewhat right hemispheric in a moment.
I think it seems very right hemispheric to me, and there's some sense of awe and wonder, of smallness in the face of the beauty and the scale of the universe around us. And I should just say that these are experiences that can still, even in me, can be triggered in religious contexts.
Have you got an example?
Well, I mean, I did my undergrad at Cambridge, and I was at King's College. King's College Chapel is possibly one of the most beautiful Christian buildings in the world. And of course you go in there. You can't not be overwhelmed by the experience of being in that space. The music that Ian mentioned right at the beginning is it's an incredibly beautiful product of religious tradition. My father's side of the family is Indian. He was brought up a Hindu in a place that used to be called Allahabad. Now it's Prayagraj, on the banks of the Ganges. Every year they have a festival there called the Kumbh Mela. It's a sort of pilgrimage site for Hindus. They come and they bathe in the Ganges. Every 12 years it's particularly big, called the Maha Kumbh Mela, which I think just means very big festival. Mm-hmm. And I was there this year, actually for the third time. I've been every 12 years since 2001. And in this festival, I mean, it's very hard to get reliable figures, but this year, possibly something of the order of 100 million people came to this festival over the course of 6 weeks. And more than that, 100 million maybe on one of the biggest days. On the day I was there were probably around 15 million people with a singular purpose to bathe in the Ganges. And I joined this river of people to bathe in the Ganges, and was just swept along, literally swept along by this river of people. And that for me was a very spiritual experience. I know very little about the theological background of Hinduism that is in the background motivating a lot of these pilgrims. But there's also something of the attenuation of the ego that I think is part of the spiritual experience there for me too.
Seeing yourself as part of a bigger whole.
I was part of something bigger, but even in a more immediate way, I just had less autonomy and agency. I couldn't just stop and go in a different direction. I was just going to go along with the flow, and that was that kind of the seeping of myself out into the others around me felt to be a very spiritual experience, and I think that's an important part of life too, finding that balance. If you live always in your head, it's not going to always be the nicest place to be.
The end of episode 1, season 1, after the debacle when he tries to date a Muslim girl, and she's like, she's American too, and she's like, you're just putting me in a Muslim box. Do you think that I'm just going to be a wife and a mother, and I don't get to have orgasms? And and so what's really good about the show, even though it's through Ramy's eyes, there are plenty of women in the show that are voicing what it's like to be a young first generation or second generation or 1.5 generation Islamic woman in America trying to figure this stuff out. Now, in this last scene in the episode, he's sitting down with the guy who confronts him about his foot washing in the mosque. And Ramy's just trying to gain status with this guy because he can, boy, the camera's got some real focus breathing issues. no, I don't know what I'm doing, man. Like, I was just thinking about you. I look at my parents and how strong they are and how they just know everything's going to be okay. So what's also fun about the series is the series will also get into these issues with the parents. Because although they were primarily formed in Egypt before they left, they've got all the American stuff to deal with. And the mom's going to be like working it through, and the dad, and you see all of the little compromises because, you know, his parents are just sort of half deconstructed. They're too old to really sort of leave the religion. They just sort of inherited it. And so they go through it, and they do take it seriously. And so Ramy looks up to his parents and they're like, wow. But he's not really seeing his parents either. And that'll come through as the show goes on, because he's often disappointed in the appropriation that his parents have of the religion. But what he expresses here is exactly what I've heard so often with deconstructed children of parents of faith. And even if the kids want to hold on to it, they can't seem to hold on to it. Always because they have God. I believe in God. I really do, man. And, you know, remember, he just had the confrontation with his Jewish girlfriend. And he has one scene where he's talking to this Muslim girl on the date, and they're sort of comparing notes about their dads. And the Muslim one date girlfriend basically says, yeah, my dad sat us down, me and my daughters, and had said, don't have sex with boys. And then he sat my brothers down and he said, don't have sex with boys. And, you know, hey, you've got this double standard in terms of, hey, you've got to preserve the purity of the girls, but the guys, man, just marry a Muslim woman. And, you know, all of that talk just kind of goes through the show. And then he's trying to come to terms with pornography and premarital sex and religion and what God thinks. And here he sits down and he esteems this guy because you got to wash the devil out from between your toes. And he says something like this. And again, he's a comedian, so he knows how to really sort of sharpen it up. But if you're a pastor, you hear this kind of stuff. People come into your office and they'll tell you what's on their heart. And if they're even a little Christ haunted, yeah, there'll be stories about what they're doing. Yeah, there are too many signs. This is why he believes in God. There's too many signs. Like one time this girl texted me 2 minutes after I jerked off to her Facebook photo. Look, we didn't talk for months. And then out of nowhere, she texts me. She texts me some. Like, you can't tell me the shit isn't all connected, you know? And yeah, I have sex even though I'm not married, and I'm probably going to try mushrooms one day. And it's like, I remember when I first watched the show, it's like, holy cow. This is just like the Muslim side of the Peterson sphere. So what? Does that mean I'm not a good Muslim? Like, I can't do it because I don't follow all the rules and the judgments that are always being put on me? And then I do the same thing. I do the same judgments on everyone around me. And I'm just trying to be good. You really think God cares if I wash between my toes? The guy says, well, you jerk off too much. It's no good. No good at all. I'm going to wash between your toes. And it's all this. And that's so then Ramy's going to go on a journey. And really the 3 seasons, and as most TV shows, the first season's the best. The second's okay. The third starts to sort of unwind and unravel in some ways. And then there's a sequel to it called Mo that's on Netflix that I watched the first episode of with one of the actors from Ramy. It wasn't nearly as good. But this is, you know, you're just getting real with it. One of the things that I remember James Wood on the Kiwitas podcast noted to Kevin Flatt that for secularists, the future becomes the eschaton. And you see this with all of this immanentized religion we have going. One of the really interesting things, so Kayla's doing a thing with Steve Skojec now, and they have this really good episode on the Skinner box. And Kale tells a story in it
And so, but, to sort of, the other day, we were sitting down for dinner, me and my family were sitting down for dinner, and a question comes up, and my wife loves the chat, loves ChatGPT. And so she immediately takes her phone out and asks ChatGPT a question. And all three of my kids immediately are like horrified by this moment. And they're like, Mom, like, what are you doing? Like, none of us are going to be able to think anymore, these kind of things. And I'm not saying anything. Okay. Just for the record. And so, I'm laughing because like, I get what they're saying and, et cetera. But, then one of my kids says something to the effect of, Mom, don't you know how much water the servers are wasting every time you prompt ChatGPT? Oh, right. So why are you laughing?
Next layer, because it's the next layer.
It's the
next layer of, but you've been propagandized in this way instead of that.
Right. And so I'm sitting there laughing at my Gen Z kids' horror at my Gen X wife's, consultation of the Oracle. And yet at the same and laughing, like, oh, that's funny, noting that generational difference. But then immediately one of my kids invokes the second layer, as you call it, and is like, and like, where does that come from? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder that all the time. My kids will say stuff too, where they'll repeat a narrative, and I'll be like, where did that? Yeah. Where did you guys get? And the thing is like, they don't watch TV, they don't watch the news, they don't, they have almost no exposure to the traditional media environment.
Right, none.
But they're getting it through. They watch YouTube. They watch like there's a whole different way this information reaches them. And I don't fully understand, in a comprehensive way, what the ecosystem looks like for how this information manages to not just be disseminated, but to sort of saturate these very non-coordinated, asymmetrical media platforms.
Yeah, and what is also fascinating to me is that, it invokes a kind of more, like there's a moral response to that, right?
Yeah.
Like their reaction was moral in two ways, right? Mom, you're letting the machine think for you, which is like, okay.
Fair criticism.
Yeah, I'm down. But then it becomes this second layer, morality tale about, server farms and, raping the environment or something like that.
Right. And it's not even, I mean, I haven't looked into this, but I mean, we've lived on this planet with the same water for all of time. It's a closed system. Like,
exactly. Yeah.
There's a water vapor cycle. It doesn't go away. You don't just destroy the water. I mean, so, but I mean, there's a base.
Okay. All these little tells make up the functional religions. I mean, the functional secular social order or sacred social order of the people. And part of what's so interesting in Ramy, and I wish, again, I could just play this because it's done so well. Because the sister is just spitting out all of the religion she really has, that she really functions with, against her parents. And, the sister has very quickly realized that life for her and life for her brother are going to be two very different things. There are two very different tracks, and she's not having it. And so she's always protesting that what she sees as the privilege of her brother, that he gets to go and do these things, he gets to do this. And then when he falls in line, boy, the focus on this, when he falls in line, she's really upset because she wanted him to be her ally and not going down this track. But if you would have asked her about Islam, do you want to be Muslim? Well, yeah. Well, what kind of Muslim do you want to be? Well, I kind of want to be the chic American kind. Well, what is that? Well, I kind of want to be the Muslim who, goes to the cool buildings and can say I, come from a place that has, exotic food. I don't want to be just kind of bland, pale, you know, I don't want to be that. But I want to be cultural. I want to have the status that whatever environment I'm in, this status can give me. And, I want to be able to have all of those things, but I don't want any of the rules. I want to be able to, and then the real religion just sort of manifests itself. And, as Kale and Steve were talking, these are kids who in many ways are being raised, in the church, away from screens. And this is something that I don't really like telling young parents, because I see them doing everything to try to immunize their children against the middle spirits of the age. And it's like, I've watched, I grew up in a bubble. The Christian Reformed Church had a big communal bubble to protect us from the world in many ways. And homeschooling, done it, seen it. No screens. Again, I pulled out my Richard Rowland, Raising Kids God's Way, and Gothard, and homeschooling, and all of that. There's no prevention here. The stuff's in the water, and your kids are going to have to deal with it. And which way they'll go, I don't know. But again, this whole show is about Ramy, and I'm still in process of sort of figuring out how I can bring the good things in the show to you, because I really just can't show stuff on YouTube. And again, for many people, it's like the future. The future is the place where all of our morality will be paid off. If we resist the AIs, or if we resist the bigotry or the racism or the heteronormity, or the just line up all the things. Even before woke got fully engaged back in 2012, 2013, when I began seeing the Christian Reformed Church just sort of come apart. And, I've told the story before, I found this website called Everyday Feminism, because I was trying to read broadly on the internet. So I was reading Salon, and I was trying to read, the trendy left websites. That's back when websites were something, before everything just became social media. And so then, I just noticed these authors quoting from Everyday Feminism. And I went there and I looked through, and I thought, the kinds of rules that wokeism is spitting out on people, it reads like a really conservative Amish or Hasidic or fundamentalist Islamic community, in terms of do this, do that, do this, do that. Here are the rules. Here are the judgments. We're going to enforce them. It's like, yeah, this is so totally a religion, because you're just trying to angle the world towards the eschaton. You're not that much difference from the Pharisees and their purity codes, and trying to get the rest of the Galileans and Judeans to comply, because the Lord's not going to come until you do this. We've got to get the procedures right so the eschaton can come. Well, if the future sort of gets, eschatized, well, what happens to the past? Well, the past is, Charles Taylor talks about it in The Secular Age. It's this ideal point. I know many of you couldn't hear Christine Hayes in that video, which it came out even worse on my video. But, she talks about, the Greeks had this mythology where, first the gods just ran everything directly, and then the gods sort of moved away. And so now, the philosopher Kings has to read into the rational, natural order. And you can just see sort of the roots of, let's say, New Atheism and that whole imaginary back there with the Greeks. And of course, then you've got the Hebrews and the Muslims and the Christians and their divine laws. And well, we got to go back to it. We got to go back to it. We got to go back to the disciples. We got to go back to Moses. We got to go back to these places, because if we can go back, then we can solve the meaning crisis. And so Ramy will go to Egypt. He'll have that affair with the woman in the mosque, and his father tells him the immigration story. And so he wants to go back and meet his grandpa. But he gets back to Egypt, and it's a mess. His cousins all want to be Americans. And he's like, but I wanted to be Egyptian. And they're like, why do you want to be Egyptian? Come on, man. Life sucks here. We want to get to America. You know, you should be like sending us stuff so we can sell it here. I mean, what good is having a cousin in America if we don't have a hookup? I mean, I lived and worked in the Dominican Republic for 6.5 years, and that was the case there. I mean, you have this enormous magnet to America, and then a generation or two people are in it, and they're like, should I go back? This is classic immigrant stuff. I saw the Dutch do it, the Dominicans do it, Ramy's about the Egyptians doing it. And then, of course, he finally finds a teacher who seems to be authentic. He finally finds a teacher that he really looks up to. It's not the old guy who's helping him clean through his toes. He's good looking, strong, and yeah, that whole scene, you know. But of course, you know what kind of Muslim he is. He's a Sufi. And this is what I noticed all along through my whole 8 years of this, and even before, everyone's just sort of hung up on the 9/11 stuff, and you know, but the good Muslims, you know who the really good Muslims are? They're the Sufis. And it's really interesting because, I mean, there's all of these religious traditions have, I wonder to a degree if, you know, what Nathan Jacobs said about orthodoxy, why it kind of gets a pass, how Sufism, in terms of all of the different elements of Islam, the Sufis get a pass. That, of course, sent me back to our own TLC boys and their Cyberpunk Islam.
Oh, there's a lot here. We can write about this. This is easily the next issue of the zine.
Yeah,
which
so
I think is
lest we are accused of just running with some foreign culture and projecting all of our worst nightmares onto it. Let's add some color, add some nuance here, and you know, anyone can chime in. How did the theme of this particular issue, well, not even necessarily how did it emerge among people, just like maybe in the culture, and then like explain the meme a bit. Let's talk about the meme, and then it's not merely just like a projection thing. So
first off, I'm not gonna deny there may be plenty of projection. If you look at the the editor's introduction, I make no bones about the fact that you're going to see as much ignorance as you are going to get like informed opinions about the internal workings of one of the great religions of the world today. So, and we make no pretensions about being accurate, but hopefully you'll read that as an open conversation. But I think the meme came together in two parts, and I'll kind of introduce the first part, and I think Matt C is probably going to be the best one to kind of give us a better rundown. But it started with I think the first thing that kind of like sparked a conversation was when Zohran Mamdani was elected mayor of New York City, and we were just kind of like just noting this pretty kind of like momentous moment. It was a little bit unprecedented and really, really interesting that one of the flagship cities of both America and the world, elected somebody who was a professed Muslim. And then we noticed also a lot of the different things he was doing to garner support from a number of different constituencies. And so we started to kind of like talk about started to explore just in conversation and just, nonsense. The difference between, I know for those of you that were coming of age in the War on Terror days, the only picture image of Islam you had was, I mean, I'm not going to make bones about saying it was pretty Islamophobic. It was pretty, designed to be like dehumanizing and create the us versus them conditions that make waging war easier. So I know, call that a more, you hear phrases like conservative or fundamentalist Islam and things like that. So we saw Mamdani got elected. It was like, well, this is not that. This is something like a progressive form of Islam. And so we started asking, well, what does that look like? And again, this became more a question than something we knew much about. So I'll kind of kick it over to Matt Seed and let him.
Yeah. So one of the things I kind of pitched to folks here is this idea that I think is very much historically justified, that the more historic, the more traditional form of Islam is, from our perspective, would be seen as progressive in a lot of ways, and this was a vehicle for more progressive types in Europe to be religious and but not, like spiritual but not religious. We know that phrase. There was a Victorian variant of that, and most of these guys became Sufis and moved to like Egypt or something and changed their name to Muhammad. And it was not considered a it wasn't considered, there wasn't like a paradox there. And really what's happened, it's very fascinating how things have happened in the 20th century, where there's kind of been a some would call a reformation of sorts in the Islamic world that has kind of worked back the, let's just get to the basics. Let's just get to what the man said with the book, right? But that, and even that's just us kind of trying to use a Christian lens to understand what's happening in Islam, because Islam is it's its own creature. But that Reformation, if we just think of that concept loosely, that's remarkably recent. And we've used that as a lens by which we've kind of characterized the whole conversation about what the future of religion in countries, particularly in the West, that have a growing Muslim population. We talk that's our way of navigating or talking about the Middle East. But then we hit these road bumps and we think, well, what's Dubai? I don't understand what's happening there. How could you have a Las Vegas of the Middle East? They must be there must be some internal inconsistency there, because they have to fit a paradigm that was kind of largely, I think, formulated, at least in our generation, in 2001. But historically, happened after, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and a lot of other things are probably not, we don't have to go into, but you can Wikipedia a lot of more mystical, spiritual, but not religious, progressive by any measure you want to measure it. You could be a bisexual. You could be all kinds of things that would be pro-progressive and a Muslim. In many corners of the world, it was understood that this was the case until World War I, essentially. So that's a crazy enough paradigm that that shakes my foundations. It shakes my generation's foundations, the post 9/11 foundations. It fits very nicely with Mamdani. It fits very nicely with the future of the current mayor of London. It could be a future prime minister of Canada, if I'm understanding the Twitter feed right. And if we're not creatively engaging with this stuff, it's just going to continue to blindside us. And if we're not going to play with it in fiction, at very least, then we're not going to have the tools to navigate it in narrative and in conversation. I just find it fascinating. So I just kind of memed it. I think I sort of force fed a couple of these guys at least to think like this. This is strange enough that maybe and it's funny in a way. It feels ironic, but then you scratch the surface and you're like, okay, maybe it's actually, if anything, there could be a future that is very cyberpunk and blends better with notions of what, the Islamic understanding of what the human soul is, and what the incarnation is. If an incarnation is a book and not a man, maybe that fits more in a ones and zeros transactional world that we're entering into. Maybe a bunch of Christians could engage with an idea that Muslims are going to be playing with stuff that are really going to that are frankly going to challenge us if the only paradigm we have to play with is the 9/11 consensus about we're all thinking Osama and we're not thinking Mamdani. You're just not reading the full playbook, because there's a bigger playbook happening, and it's always been there, and Western people were plagued with it very much until 5 seconds ago, and then we all had collective amnesia because of the world wars. So that's my pitch.
Part of the danger I run with a video like this is I'm an explainer. You've walked down the path and you've been re-enchanted, and now I'm just going to come and provoke another meaning crisis. Well, first of all, I think part of your journeys through things tend to inoculate. You're probably on one hand always going to feel the pull of the old nihilism, but on the other side, you've already know that that's no way to go back to. And just because you see a meaning crisis layer that's broad and deep through a culture, and the different religions are all going to have to pass through it, doesn't mean that, doesn't mean a perennialism or it's same or whatever. I'm not saying any of that, because I myself have, wrestled with deconstruction and nihilism and all of these things, and I've never left my faith. Some people sort of get spit out and roll around and never find their way back. Some people were never born into it, pass through it and come up, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't mean that this layer that people pass through isn't real. It's very real. And I think a big part of what the TLC is about is we're just trying to make our way through it together. And because it's unusual, I look at these four guys, I've met each one in person. Afriel came and volunteered here, helped to fix up rooms for a future estuary conference. Matt C. Have I met Matt C in person? Matt C, super sharp guy, really interesting guy. Again, one of the reformed guys in the corner. Then there's Matt Skankenstein. Had a really wonderful conversation with him in the airport after one of the conferences. Got to know him a little bit, got to hear some of his story. I don't know, Matt, maybe, I don't know how much the part of the thing about the randos is that many of the best stories we can't tell on the internet, because there's people that can be hurt, or at least don't deserve having their stories told involuntarily out to the world. So we got to be careful. Nick Freerillian has shared some of his story. So everyone here has been through stuff. And again, part of why it's sort of interesting to look at something like Ramy and notice the connections is because it helps you discover the layer. You can see some of the peculiarities of Islam that differ, let's say, from European Christianity, but you can see the layer better. All right, that's it for now. Leave a comment.